Hello and welcome. Today we're going to explore one of the most ambitious and complex philosophical systems ever developed, absolute idealism, primarily shaped by the German philosopher Hegel. Absolute idealism offers a vision of reality as an integrated whole, where what we perceive as contradictions or separations, like between mind and matter, individual and community, subject and object, are actually necessary components of a larger, coherent process. Absolute idealism is more than a metaphysical system. It's a profound reinterpretation of reality, consciousness, ethics, and history. Today, I'm going to attempt to guide you through its core ideas, explain the logic of dialectics that drives it, and also attempt to connect it to ethical and social concepts. Along the way, we will also draw upon some other philosophies to clarify how absolute idealism fits into the broader philosophical landscape. So let's begin with the foundations of absolute idealism, which is the absolute itself. In Hegel's view, reality is ultimately a unified, interconnected whole. He called this whole the absolute, a term which captures the totality of all existence, both material and immaterial, and the essential rationality that underlies it. As Hegel wrote, "The truth is the whole, but the whole is nothing other than essence consummating itself through its development." This idea that reality is a rational, self-developing whole contrasts sharply with traditional views, which often divide reality into mind and matter, or physical and metaphysical realms. For Hegel, these distinctions are ultimately illusory, or, to be more precise, they are partial perspectives. They capture aspects of reality but fail to recognize the underlying unity that binds everything together. In Hegel's absolute idealism, the world is not divided into separate substances. Instead, all phenomena are expressions of a single self-unfolding reality. This view places Hegel's philosophy in contrast to dualism, like that of René Descartes, who saw reality as divided between mind and body. It also stands apart from materialism, which reduces reality to purely physical substances. Hegel's vision is different. For him, the entire cosmos is animated by an inherent rationality that can only be understood as a whole. At the heart of Hegel's absolute idealism lies a unique and powerful method: dialectics. You may have heard Hegel's dialectics simplified as a three-step process: thesis, antithesis, and synthesis. But Hegel's dialectical approach is more sophisticated and essential to his vision of reality as a dynamic, evolving unity. In Hegel's system, reality is structured by internal contradictions that propel it forward. As he writes in The Science of Logic, contradiction is the root of all movement and vitality. It is only so far as something has a contradiction within it that it moves, has an urge and activity. For Hegel, contradictions are not errors or like breakdowns in the logical order. Instead, they are the driving force of reality itself. So let's break down the dialectical process to understand how it functions. So thesis and antithesis. Every concept or phenomenon exists as a thesis, which inevitably encounters its opposite, or antithesis. For example, freedom can be seen as the opposite of necessity, or individual autonomy in contrast to societal obligation. These oppositions are not accidental. They arise naturally out of the limitations of any single perspective. Sublation. So, there is a German word that I can't pronounce, so I'm not even going to try, but it means both to preserve and to transcend. And this particular word captures Hegel's notion of sublation, where contradictions are not simply cancelled out, but instead are integrated into a higher synthesis. In the case of freedom and necessity, the synthesis might reveal that true freedom is not a matter of resisting necessity, but rather of acting in harmony with it. In this way, dialectics is a dynamic process of becoming. Each stage of thought or existence generates its opposites, and through their interaction, a new, more comprehensive understanding emerges. This process continues, moving ever closer to a complete self-understanding, which Hegel describes as the absolute. Absolute idealism proposes that the absolute is not merely a passive unity, but an active, self-realizing consciousness. This idea was revolutionary and was indeed distinct from earlier forms of idealism, such as subjective idealism in the work of George Berkeley, who argued that reality exists only in the perceptions of individual minds. Hegel's absolute, however, is not the sum of individual perceptions, but a universal mind or spirit, Geist, that becomes aware of itself through human history and culture. Hegel's view of the absolute as a self-realizing consciousness leads us to a crucial insight. The development of human consciousness is essential to the self-realization of the absolute. Human beings, as conscious and rational agents, play a unique role in this process. Through our thoughts, reflections, cultures, and histories, we enable the absolute to achieve self-awareness. In Phenomenology of Spirit, Hegel describes a journey of consciousness that progresses from simple awareness to self-consciousness, then to reason, and ultimately to absolute knowledge. This journey is not only an individual progression, but reflects the development of humanity as a whole. Each stage, such as the development of art, religion, and philosophy, is a necessary step in the absolute's path to understanding, or to self-understanding. A central theme in absolute idealism is the experience of alienation and the possibility of reconciliation. Alienation, in Hegel's view, is the feeling that separation from the world, from others, or even from oneself. This alienation occurs because we initially perceive ourselves as independent, isolated beings cut off from the larger world. In the dialectical process, alienation is a necessary stage, and yet it leads ultimately to reconciliation. As consciousness evolves, it begins to see itself not as separate, but as part of the absolute. Reconciliation is a kind of spiritual and intellectual reunion where individuals recognize themselves as expressions of the larger rational whole. This notion of alienation and reconciliation influenced later thinkers like Karl Marx, who adapted Hegel's concept of alienation to critique economic and social conditions under capitalism. For Marx, alienation was not merely a psychological state, but a real condition resulting from the exploitation and division inherent in capitalist societies. While Marx diverged from Hegel's idealism, focusing on material conditions, he nonetheless drew heavily from Hegel's concept of reconciliation as a way to envision a society where individuals could fully realize themselves. Hegel's absolute idealism extends beyond metaphysics and epistemology to offer a framework for ethics and social philosophy. In Hegel's view, true freedom and moral development are not achieved in isolation, but through participation in social institutions like family, civil society, and the state. So Hegel introduces the concept of ethical life, which refers to the idea that individuals find true freedom within the ethical and social structures in which they live. As he writes in Elements of the Philosophy of Right, the right of the individual will is to be in accord with the universal will. Hegel's point is that true freedom is not about resisting society's constraints, but about finding a form of self-realization within a community. Ethical life is achieved through shared institutions that embody rational freedom. So I mentioned before about Hegel's social institutions, so family, civil society, and the state. So now we're going to have a quick look at each of those and explain exactly what Hegel was referring to. So we'll start with family. For Hegel, the family is the first ethical sphere, where individuals learn to live in a union that transcends individual desires. And then we have a more complex level, as it were, which is civil society, where individuals pursue their interests within a framework of rights and contracts. And finally, we have the state. So Hegel sees the state as the highest form of ethical life. The state, in his view, embodies the universal ethical will, reconciling individual freedom with the welfare of the whole. The state is not a mere political entity, but a rational community that realizes the ethical spirit. So these three, what's the word I'm looking for? These three social institutions, that's the word I was looking for. They are essentially like different ethical spheres. That's essentially how he was positioning them. So Hegel's view of the state is often misunderstood as being like authoritarian, but he didn't advocate for the oppression of the individual. Instead, he saw the state as a rational entity where individuals achieve their highest freedom by aligning their actions with the ethical whole. So, to understand absolute idealism fully, we must grapple with the ontological status of the absolute itself. Hegel's absolute is not a static entity, but instead is a process of becoming. Unlike traditional concepts of God, which view the divine as unchanging and as like an external creator, Hegel's absolute is immanent within the world and constantly evolving. This concept of the absolute as a process challenges classical theism and reflects a more pantheistic view, where divinity and the universe are inseparably entwined. For Hegel, ultimate reality is not like a substance or a thing, but a living, rational, self-realizing consciousness. Hegel's famous statement, "What is rational is actual, and what is actual is rational," encapsulates this view. It suggests that reality itself is rational and structured in such a way that all contradictions, conflicts and differences are actually part of a larger rational order. This rationality is not a rigid structure, but a dynamic, self-developing system. This processive and like self-realizing aspect of the absolute sets Hegel's philosophy apart from both classical metaphysics and empirical materialism. It invites us to see reality not as a collection of isolated parts, but as a whole that achieves self-consciousness and rationality through its own unfolding. So, in conclusion, absolute idealism presents a vision of reality as a coherent, dynamic, and rational whole. Through the dialectical process, contradictions are integrated into a higher synthesis, ultimately revealing that all things, mind and matter, freedom and necessity, individual and community, are expressions of a single rational reality, the absolute. This philosophy challenges us to transcend dualism and seek unity, to see human consciousness as a stage in the absolute's journey towards self-realization. And perhaps most radically, it invites us to consider that freedom and fulfillment are found not in isolation, but through our relationships with rational communities. In absolute idealism, each of us is part of a larger story, a journey towards self-awareness and reconciliation, where we come to recognize ourselves as integral parts of a single interconnected reality. So that is a pretty good, I thought anyway, a pretty good overview of Hegel's absolute idealism. And it is a great starting point to think further about it, to think more deeply about it. If you have the opportunity, I highly recommend that you go and read Hegel's works and have a look at some of the sort of existentialist thinkers, because they took some of these ideas and were quite influenced by some of these ideas. So you can see where it sort of led to, and so on. So there's a lot about absolute idealism that I haven't covered in the video. As with anything, it would be impossible to cover it all in one. So I have tried my best to give an overview that will enable you to understand the concepts and give you a pretty solid foundation from which you can go forwards and learn more about it. So thank you for watching. I hope you found this video interesting, and if you did, I would like to ask, if you wouldn't mind at all, if you could do all the YouTube things, like the video, subscribe to the channel, and so on and so forth. It would really help me out and would be greatly appreciated. But there is no pressure. So, as I say, thank you for watching and listening, and I hope you have a wonderful day, and I look forward to seeing you on the next one.